Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Before delving into Aeschylus's Oresteia, it is important to first explore the origins and evolution of Greek tragedy as a literary form. This includes a brief examination of its staging in Athens and the context in which it developed. And with this foundation in place, we can then turn our attention to Aeschylus himself and his monumental trilogy, the Oresteia, one of the greatest masterpieces of literature in any language. The exact beginnings of Greek tragedy remain uncertain. We do not know precisely when it emerged or how it evolved. Tradition, however, attributes the first recorded performance of a tragedy to one Thespis in Athens in the year 534 BC. According to Aristotle, the 4th century BC philosopher, scientist, literary critic, the master of those who know, as Dante would later call him. Tragedy originated when one Thespis distinguished himself from the dithyrambic chorus by portraying a character rather than merely narrating events. Dithyrambs were choral hymns dedicated to Dionysus, and Aristotle suggests that Thespis's innovation, stepping out of the chorus to enact a role, marked the birth of what would become the dramatic art of tragedy. This is certainly possible, but our limited knowledge of dithyramb makes it difficult to assess the accuracy of Aristotle's claim. Writing nearly 2 centuries after Thespis, Aristotle offers an influential perspective, no doubt, yet he was not a direct witness to the origins of tragedy and may not have had a complete understanding of how it developed. It is well established, though, that both tragedy and comedy were presented during annual festivals dedicated to the god Dionysus, most notably the City Dionysia and the Lenaea festivals. Just as the dithyramb was a poetic performance honoring Dionysus, so too were tragedy and comedy, both serving as distinct poetic expressions within these religious celebrations. Most surviving tragedies and comedies, however, make little direct reference to Dionysus, leaving the precise nature of his connection to drama somewhat uncertain. In fact, the ancient Greek phrase "ouden pros Dionyson," meaning nothing to do with Dionysus, served as a common expression, akin to the English saying, "What does that have to do with the price of tea in China?" Some scholars propose that tragedy did not originate from the dithyramb, as Aristotle suggests, but rather evolved from early ritual dramas performed in Dionysus's honor. And indeed, this seems to be suggested even by the very word tragedy, tragodia, which in Greek comes from the word for goat, dragos, which would have been presumably some kind of sacrificial animal. And while there is no definitive evidence to confirm this theory that it had a ritual origin, it remains possible that such ritual performances existed and that tragedy eventually broadened its scope to incorporate a wider range of plot lines. An alternative hypothesis posits that the genesis of tragedy is not to be located in the differentiation of an individual performer from the dithyrambic chorus, as Aristotle contends, but rather in the confluence of epic poetry and lyric traditions. This argument carries significant intellectual weight given that epic narrative already encompassed the recitation of direct speech, wherein a narrator would introduce a character's words, for example, thus spoke Agamemnon, and then proceed to deliver the character's speech, and subsequently conclude with a framing device such as, so he spoke. It requires only a modest conceptual leap, then, to envision the emergence of a second performer who would assume responsibility for enacting the spoken lines, thereby allowing the narrative voice to evolve into what would later be formalized as the tragic chorus, while a separate figure embodied distinct dramatic personae. Under this interpretive framework, tragedy may be understood as arising from the interweaving of epic recitation, traditionally the domain of a singular bard, with the choral lyric tradition ultimately yielding the dramatic form that came to be recognized as tragedy. Nevertheless, the precise origins of the genre remain elusive and in all likelihood will continue to resist definitive historical reconstruction. As I mentioned a moment ago, tragedies were performed as part of the dramatic competition known as the City Dionysia, an annual festival in Athens dedicated to the god Dionysius, hence its name. In addition to this prominent urban festival, various rural celebrations also honored Dionysius. Each year, three tragedians competed for distinction, vying for first, second, and third place. As part of the competition, each playwright presented a tetralogy consisting of three tragedies, followed by a so-called satyr play, a short comedic and often bawdy burlesque featuring satyrs, that those half human, half goat companions of Dionysius, as its chorus. A panel of judges then would determine the rankings, conferring prizes upon the competing tragedians. One significant implication of this competitive structure is that that the great tragedians of ancient Greece all composed their works with the expectation that they would be performed only once. Unlike modern playwrights, who may aspire to extended theatrical runs, Aeschylus, for instance, when crafting his Oresteia, was not anticipating a multi-year engagement akin to a Broadway production. Rather, he composed his trilogy with the understanding that it would receive a single performance at that year's festival, after which it would give way to new works in subsequent competitions. The subject matter of Greek tragedy was primarily drawn from established mythological narratives, though on rare occasions tragedians would craft plays based on recent historical events. Notably, the earliest surviving Greek tragedy, Aeschylus's Persians, performed in 472 BC, focused on the then recent conflict between Greece and Persia, providing a dramatic reflection on events in the aftermath of the Persian Wars. By drawing their plots from myth as an overwhelmingly predominant source, tragedians worked within a framework that the majority of their audience would immediately be already familiar with. As a result, their creativity and artistry were not in the invention of new narratives, but in their interpretation, their manipulation of the established mythological material. While adhering to the broad structure of the traditional story, the tragedian had the freedom to focus on, reshape, and emphasize particular elements or themes to suit his artistic intentions. In this respect, the tragedian's approach closely mirrors that of the authors of the Iliad and Odyssey, who similarly reshaped and reinterpreted traditional myths to convey their own unique perspectives and artistry. However, the key distinction between the authors of the Iliad and the Odyssey, on the one hand, whom we do not know who they were, but which we traditionally ascribe to one Homer, and the Greek tragedians, on the other hand, lies in the fact that we have a clear historical record of the tragedians' identities. Unlike Homer, who didn't exist at all, we know the names of the tragedians, we know the dates of their works, and the specific contexts in which they wrote. This allows us to be more precise in discerning the political, social, and cultural influences that may have shaped their reinterpretations of myth in their tragedies, providing a clear understanding of the forces driving their artistic choices. The cast of a Greek tragedy typically consisted of three actors and a chorus. These plays were performed in outdoor, open-air theaters where there was minimal use of artificial staging, sound effects, or scenery, and certainly no artificial lighting whatsoever. All actors were male, and the three performers portrayed every individual role within the play. This necessitated that a single actor take on multiple roles throughout the production. For example, one actor might first appear as Agamemnon, then exit the stage and return to play Aegisthus, Agamemnon's cousin and murderer, thereby shifting between different characters within a single performance. Moreover, given that all the actors in Greek tragedy were male, The portrayal of iconic female characters such as Clytemnestra, Antigone, Electra, and Medea were all also undertaken by men. This practice mirrors the situation in Shakespearean theater, interestingly, where female roles were similarly played by male actors. But returning to the Greek theater, these two key aspects of Athenian acting, that is, the convention of a single actor portraying multiple roles within a single play, and the use of male performers for female characters, those two aspects were both made feasible by the use of masks, which helped to clearly distinguish characters. This reproduction of a 5th century BC painting, which you see in front of you, Greek painting, shows an actor holding a mask. The actors always wore masks, which not only facilitated the rapid transition between roles, but also allowed the audience to easily recognize when an actor returned as a different character. The change of mask, rather than the actor's physical appearance, signaled the transformation, thus minimizing potential confusion for the audience. The chorus, like the actors, were also composed entirely of male performers, all of whom wore masks. Typically consisting of 12 or in some cases 15 members, the chorus often represented a marginalized group within the narrative, such as old men, women, or slaves. Rather than actively participating in the events of the drama, the chorus primarily served a commentary role, offering reflections on the action, presenting mythological exempla that paralleled the unfolding of events, and supplying background information to the audience. While it did not engage directly in the plot, the chorus played a crucial role in shaping the thematic and emotional tone of the performance. The term chorus, choros in Greek, derives from the Greek word choreo, meaning to dance. We hear this in our word choreograph. And this reflects the integral role of both movement and music in its performance. Like the performers of choral lyric poetry, the chorus in Greek tragedy not only sang its lines, but also danced as part of the dramatic presentation. Greek tragedies were composed entirely in poetic form, and yet, but the dialogue in between choruses was spoken rather than sung. But the choruses were sung and indeed danced. This fusion of song, then, of movement and drama, is one of the foundational characteristics of the genre. In fact, the origins of opera in Italy can be traced to an attempt to recreate the staging practices of Greek tragedy, particularly the combination of music and theatrical performance. Therefore, when we think of Greek tragedy, it is helpful to envision something closer to opera than to the spoken drama of, say, Shakespeare, which may seem surprising given the contrast in style and form. The conditions in the theater of Dionysius um, in Athens would have precluded any kind of naturalistic acting, even had all the words been spoken rather than sung. The audience probably consisted of somewhere between 12,000 and 17,000 people, most of whom were a significant distance from the actors. In a Greek theater, as you see in front of you, most people sat pretty far away from the slanted seating that went up a hillside. It was almost like watching an athletic competition, like a football game, where one recognizes players not by their faces, but by their jerseys, since they're so far away. The conditions at the Theatre of Dionysius in Athens would have made naturalistic acting virtually impossible. Uh, and therefore, and um, this and in just such a setting as this, where one can identify players by not by their facial expressions, but by their masks, the Greek theater goers would have had recognized the actors by their masks, but there would have been a greater emphasis on their gestures and than any kind of facial subtleties or expressions or realistic movements. And this physical separation between the actors and the audience would have shaped the style of performance, which emphasizes vocal delivery, gesture, and the symbolic power of masks over any realistic portrayal. The 5th century BC, during which tragedy truly flourished in Athens, was a time of remarkable intellectual, cultural, and political innovation, as well as considerable social and military upheaval. The unique combination of creativity and turmoil provided, it seems, an ideal environment for the flourishing of Greek tragedy. While many tragedians were active during this period, complete plays from only three of them, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, have come down to us. However, these three figures were regarded as exceptional talents in their own time, shaping the course of drama and leaving a lasting legacy that would influence the evolution of drama for millennia to come. The first of these three great tragedians, Aeschylus, is believed to have been born around the year 525 BC, though the exact year of his birth remains uncertain. And he died in the year 456 BC, a date that we know for certain because he is said by ancient chronographers to have died in that year following his victory at the city Dionysia. Aeschylus is credited with writing 90 plays, of which the titles of 82 are known to us through ancient sources. However, only seven of his plays have survived in full, meaning that a vast majority of his literary output is lost to history, leaving us with just a small fraction of his dramatic legacy. Furthermore, one of even these seven surviving plays attributed to Aeschylus, Prometheus Bound, is the subject of significant scholarly debate regarding its authorship, where nowadays most scholars contend that it was not actually written by Aeschylus himself, but rather by another playwright, most probably his grandson, who, because of Athenian naming practices, would have had the name Aeschylus as well. One was always named after one's grandfather, you see. Um, and just the stylistic and thematic differences between Prometheus Bound and Aeschylus's other works, and the use of vocabulary that did not exist during Aeschylus's time but was used at a later point, have all pointed to have all pointed scholars to the direction that this play was actually not by him. We know relatively little about Aeschylus's life beyond his involvement in the pivotal Persian Wars at the dawn of the 5th century BC. He is recorded as having fought at the Battle of Marathon in 490 BC during the first invasion of the Persians into Greece, and it is highly likely that he also participated at the Battle of Salamis in 480 BC during the second Persian invasion. Interestingly, his epitaph, which tradition claims he wrote himself, suggests that he valued his military service more than his work as a tragedian. It is simply four lines in the Greek, and it says, Aeschylus the Athenian, the son of Euphorion, lies here in a grave decaying in wheat-bearing Gela, which is in Sicily. The long-haired Persian at the field of Marathon knows his glorious valor well. It's a stirring epitaph. And the fact that it mentions only his participation in the Persian Wars, with no reference to his plays or achievements in the theater, which were also considered a form of civic service, implies that Aeschylus considered his role in the Greek victory at Marathon to be the most important achievement of his life, far more significant than his contributions to drama. Uh, is as monumental as those are. The extant record pertaining to Aeschylus's career as a tragedian um, far surpasses those regarding his personal life. His inaugural triumph at the city Dionysia occurred, we know, in the year 484 BC, marking the beginning of what would become an illustrious career. Ancient sources offer divergent accounts of his total number of victories, with one asserting that he claimed 13 first place honors, while another posits a significantly higher number of 28. This discrepancy between sources, though reflective of the uncertainties inherent in ancient historiography, serves to underscore Aeschylus's preeminent stature, no matter which number you go with in the Athenian dramatic festivals. But uh, that higher figure of 28 victories likely incorporates triumphs that were achieved posthumously, That is, as his works were restaged in subsequent competitions after his death. The mere fact that Aeschylus's tragedies were allowed to be re-entered into the city of Dionysia at all, long after his passing, is a testament to the extraordinary esteem in which he was held at Athens. This was by no means a commonplace occurrence, since the restaging of a playwright's works after his death was a rare and exceptional honor. Aeschylus was regarded, though, as such an eminent figure in the realm of tragedy that some of his plays continued to secure first place victories even after his death. And so it is plausible that he may have won first prize several times posthumously, further solidifying his legacy, and that is why we have this higher number in the sources. As I noted earlier, each tragedian was required to submit 3 plays for competition each year. Aeschylus, in particular, demonstrated a preference for composing trilogies built around a unified theme. Rather than presenting 3 separate plays with distinct storylines, he chose to carry a single narrative across all 3 plays, effectively treating them as 3 interconnected acts of a much longer drama. This structural approach allowed him to delve deeply into the evolution of one storyline across the full spectrum of the trilogy, with the potential for thematic continuity even extending to the satyr play that accompanied the tragedies. One might wonder how we are able to deduce all this from the limited number of plays that have survived, and the answer lies in the fact that of the surviving 82 titles of Aeschylus's plays, when these are examined, they can be noted that they are grouped into sets of 3 each year for the competitions that scholars can identify as forming unified thematic entities. These groupings allow us to discern that rather than presenting 3 independent plays, Aeschylus frequently submitted trilogies that focused on a single overarching storyline. Now, the only surviving example of Aeschylus's use of the trilogy form is his Oresteia. Unlike Aeschylus, the playwrights Sophocles and Euripides did not typically employ the trilogy structure. While they often presented 3 plays that may have shared a thematic link, such as exploring similar motifs or troubled relationships, for example, their works did not adhere to the same continuous narrative thread that characterized Aeschylus's trilogies. In other words, Sophocles and Euripides generally avoided treating their 3 plays as part of a single cohesive storyline, focusing instead on distinct, though thematically related, works. This may strike some of you as a surprise if you've been taught in high school, for instance, about the Theban trilogy, which is a term commonly used to refer to Sophocles' 3 plays about Oedipus and his family. But it is important to note that these plays were not originally conceived or written as a trilogy. They were composed in different years and for different occasions. For instance, his Antigone, Sophocles' Antigone, was written approximately 15 years before his Oedipus the King, Oedipus Rex. And the third of those so-called Theban plays, Oedipus at Colonus, was penned at the very, very end of Sophocles' life, so many, many years after both of those other 2. And as a result, while these 3 plays are thematically related, they were not written to be performed as a cohesive trilogy. So the label Theban trilogy is really a misnomer. In contrast, however, Aeschylus's Oresteia stands as I said, the only complete trilogy that has survived, though even this work is not fully preserved since we lack the accompanying satyr play. We therefore do not possess any fully intact set of tetralogies of the 3 tragedies paired with a satyr play from ancient Greek drama. The Oresteia was performed in the year 458 BC, just 2 years before Aeschylus's death, marking it as a work of his mature period. As the only surviving trilogy, it provides an invaluable window into the structure and intent behind the trilogy form in Aeschylus's hands. It reveals how Aeschylus skillfully explored a central theme or set of interconnected themes across all 3 plays. In the Oresteia, Aeschylus establishes ideas in the first play that are developed further in the second and ultimately resolved in the third. The trilogy not only showcases how complex thematic elements and imagery evolve over the course of the plays, but also illustrates how specific turns of phrase, vocabulary, imagery from the first play reappear and are subtly amplified in the subsequent ones. And we're going to explore all those in subsequent lectures. Through repetition and variation, these motifs build toward a climactic resolution, underscoring the intricate artistry with which Aeschylus wove his narrative across this trilogy. And it really is just a complete artistic masterpiece. Now, at this point, I should probably clarify the term which I've been using throughout this talk, that is the term tragedy, and clearly define it as it was used in ancient Greek, that it did not necessarily imply a terribly sad story in the way that we understand the term today. While many of the mythological narratives chosen by tragedians rather, were indeed tragic in the modern sense, filled with suffering, that is, with loss and misfortune, the term tragedy initially referred more to the form of the drama than to its content. It's a genre, therefore. And now, the majority of Greek tragedies do follow tragic storylines due to the nature of the myths, but it is worth noting that, as we will see in time, the Oresteia actually concludes on a relatively positive note. The conflicts are resolved, and a sense of order is restored. While Agamemnon, the first play in the trilogy, undeniably does exemplify the tragic genre in the sense we typically associate with that term, the final play, the Eumenides, does not fit this mold. And so, in its earliest usage, the term tragedy primarily denoted the specific dramatic structure rather than a fixed emotional tone or outcome. The first play of the Oresteia, the Agamemnon, centers on the hero Agamemnon's return from the Trojan War and his subsequent murder at the hands of his wife Clytemnestra, and her lover Aegisthus. It is worth noting that the name of Agamemnon's wife, as it appears in different authors, has different forms. It is usually given as Clytemnestra. That's sort of the usual form, but Aeschylus actually calls her Clytemnestra. So just to be clear on that. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. In order to understand Aeschylus's Oresteia, it is essential first to grasp the mythological foundations upon which it stands. And so, what I would like to do now is to pivot in this lecture to an introduction that will provide an overview of two intertwined narratives, which Aeschylus expected his audience to know well. That is, the first, the tale of the Trojan War, and the tragic history of the house of Atreus is the second. These two stories were not just central to Greek theater, but were deeply embedded in Greek literature and cultural traditions. The Trojan War is undoubtedly the most renowned episode of all classical mythology. Its significance stemmed from the fact that the Greeks themselves considered it a defining event, shaping their literature beyond tragedy into epic and other forms. Homer's Iliad and Odyssey are the most prominent examples. By the 5th century BC, the Trojan War was perceived as the dividing line between the age of heroes, beings who, though mortal, were seen as somehow closer to the divine, and the age of ordinary human history. Many Greek families, especially in Athens, took pride in tracing their lineage to the legendary warriors of Troy, similar to the way some today cherish ancestry linked to historic migrations. We might think of the Boston Brahmins, or people who can trace their lineage back to the Mayflower or something like that. This war functioned as a transitional event, linking a mythical past to the present. Because of this liminality, its role as a bridge between eras, it became one of the most widely explored themes in Greek literature. The Trojan War and its associated myths appear repeatedly in various tragic plays, both surviving and no longer extant, dealing with events leading up to the war, its unfolding, and its long-lasting consequences. The second narrative, integral to the Oresteia, is the tale of the house of Atreus, the royal lineage to which Agamemnon belongs. This family's saga is deeply enmeshed with the Trojan War, since Agamemnon and his brother Menelaus played crucial roles in leading the Greek forces to Troy. The war itself was precipitated by a personal affront. Paris, a Trojan prince, seduced and absconded with Helen, the wife of Menelaus. However, for the Greeks, this act was not merely an offense against one individual, because it violated xenia, the sacred guest-host relationship which was protected, overseen by none other than Zeus himself. Thus, this relationship of having having a relationship where a person could stay at your house, a guest, and you were the host, there were certain responsibilities that were incumbent upon you to treat that person well, and of course to let him go when he wanted to go, but there were responsibilities incumbent upon the guest too. Obviously, running off with with your host's wife would be a grave violation of that. And so avenging Helen's abduction became a matter of divine justice as well as personal honor. And this is a point that runs throughout both the Iliad and the Odyssey on many occasions. This institution of xenia. Greek tragedians and their audiences did not regard these tales as purely mythical in the sense of being fictional. The Trojan War was seen as an actual historical event, albeit one that took place centuries before. The traditionally accepted date for Troy's fall was around the year 1184 BC. However, there was also an acknowledgement that the world had changed since those times. In the age of heroes, mortals and gods interacted more freely, something that no longer occurred in the contemporary world of Aeschylus's Athens. This period of divine human interaction was believed to have ended with the Trojan War. Despite its cultural importance, though, no single surviving ancient text provides a complete account of the Trojan War. Instead, its story has to be reconstructed from scattered references in epic poetry, tragedy, and other literary sources. The brief outline is that, in essence, the war began when Paris, under the influence of Aphrodite's promise, took Helen from Sparta to Troy. Her husband Menelaus, with his brother Agamemnon, rallied an immense Greek army to retrieve her. Before they could set sail, however, unfavorable winds, believed to be the result of Artemis's wrath, stalled their departure at a place called Aulis, which is where the Greek army was stationed, waiting to set sail to go to Troy. To appease the goddess Artemis, Agamemnon made a dire choice: sacrifice his own daughter Iphigenia or disband the army. And he chose to sacrifice his own daughter Iphigenia to Artemis so as to get the winds to make the boats be able to go to Troy. This act not only enabled the Greeks to reach Troy, but it also deepened the curse that plagued his family. We'll more on that, though, in a moment. When they were at Troy, for a decade, the war raged on, marked by fierce battles between legendary warriors like Achilles and Hector. This is the plot of the Iliad. Eventually, though, the Greeks, unable to conquer Troy through conventional means, resorted to cunning. Odysseus devised the ruse of the Trojan horse, which led to the city's downfall. However, the Greek victory was tainted by atrocities, including the brutal killing of King Priam as he gripped the altar in a shrine, and also the sacrilegious violation of Cassandra in Athena's temple by the Greek warrior Ajax. These transgressions enraged the gods, ensuring that many Greek leaders faced perilous and prolonged journeys home, none more famous than Odysseus's 10-year Odyssey, which is the subject of Homer's Odyssey. Among those who suffered upon returning from Troy was in particular Agamemnon, whose fate was sealed both by his past actions and his family's cursed legacy. Because the house of Atreus was notorious for its history of internal violence, beginning with its founder Tantalus, who offended the gods in a gruesome act of hubris. And I'm going to now switch from the Trojan War to talking about the house of Atreus, which is the second major mythological backstory that you need to know before we can read Aeschylus's Agamemnon. The founder of the house of Atreus was Tantalus, and he committed an offense against the gods, and his transgression is deeply tied to one of the central themes in Greek mythology, that is the fundamental division between gods and humans. This division, as depicted in myth, is not merely one of power, not merely one of beauty or other attributes in which gods surpass humans, but it rests on a far more profound distinction, namely immortality. The gods are immortal, incapable of dying, whereas humans are inherently mortal and must eventually die. This stark contrast, the immortality of the gods versus the mortality of humans, constitutes the primary distinction between the divine and the human in Greek myth. Tantalus's offense against the gods is recounted in two main versions of his story in various authors, both of which reflect his profound hubris. The more widely known story portrays Tantalus as having attempted to trick the gods by serving them the flesh of his own son, Pelops, whom he had murdered. He does so, he wants to test their knowledge, and so he murders his own son and brings the gods, invites them to a banquet. Tantalus dismembers his killed son Pelops and cooks his flesh, presenting it to the gods as a meal. And this act suggests that the gods, of course, were interacting with humans in a much more intimate way than would happen in kind of post-Trojan War times. But more importantly, Tantalus's action seems to challenge the gods' superiority, implying that they could be deceived. By offering them human flesh, Tantalus might have been asserting that the gods were not all-knowing and could be tricked into committing a heinous act, such as the one he is trying to perpetuate. However, the gods were not deceived. They recognized Pelops immediately, and in their divine wisdom, resurrected him. One goddess did not get the message about that. That was Demeter, who was distracted by her grief over the absence of her daughter Persephone, who, you remember, spent part of each year in the underworld. And so, absent-mindedly, she did eat part of Pelops. She ate his shoulder. And when Pelops was revived by the gods, they replaced this missing part of him with a shoulder made of ivory. Um, that was part of the deal. An alternative version of Tantalus's offense suggests that he attempted to steal nectar and ambrosia, the food and drink of the gods, that were believed to grant immortality. And this version of the myth underscores Tantalus's ambition to usurp the gods' divine nature by acquiring the very substance that sustained their immortality. To steal nectar and ambrosia would, in essence, be to steal immortality itself, an act in Greek myth of unredeemable hubris that sealed his fate. And so, whichever version you go with, both versions of the myth center on Tantalus's attempt to transcend the natural order, to defy the gods' superiority, and to claim what was divinely reserved for the immortal beings alone. And as I say, regardless of which version of the myth one accepts, Tantalus's transgression fundamentally revolves around this blurring of the lines between mortals and immortals, between humans and gods, and it does so in a way that is intrinsically linked to inappropriate eating, whether through his attempt to force the gods into consuming human flesh, or through his own attempt to steal the gods' divine sustenance, nectar and ambrosia. Tantalus's offense is an act of transgressive consumption that crosses boundaries that ought not to be transgressed. And because of this, he is punished in the underworld with a certain kind of colorful and agonizing torment. Greek mythology excels at crafting uniquely psychological forms of punishment for its greatest wrongdoers, and Tantalus's fate is one of the more emblematic of these cruel and imaginative tortures. He is condemned to stand forever in a river, the crystalline, beautiful waters rising only to his chin, and fruit trees growing abundantly just out of his reach. And every time he reaches up to grab the fruit, the branches recede out of his grasp. Every time he drops his head down to drink the beautiful water, it recedes into the dust. And so he is forever, are you ready for this? Tantalized, that is the origin of that word. Hungry and thirsty, and with these things dangling in front of him, but he cannot get them. He's perpetually tantalized, yearning for them. Tantalus is, the story goes on, though. The next generation, Pelops, um, he continues the pattern of the familiar curse. After he is put back together again by the gods, he travels far and wide, ending up in the peninsula down in the southern part of Greece that was named after him, the Peloponnesus. It actually comes from the name Pelops. And he was determined on one occasion to win the hand in marriage of a certain woman named Hippodamia. Now, Hippodamia's father was one Oinomaus, and had decreed that anyone who wanted to marry his daughter had to beat him in a chariot race. And if the man, the suitor, lost the race, then that man would be killed. Pelops resorted to treachery in his chariot race that won him his bride, setting off a new cycle of curses. He enlisted the help of Oenomaus's own charioteer Myrtilus, who for a bribe sabotaged Oenomaus's chariot by loosening the linchpins of the wheels, causing the chariot to break apart during the race. And this act of betrayal led to Oenomaus's death and to Pelops's victory. In the aftermath of the race, Pelops, now victorious, took Hippodamia as his bride, but his actions set, as I said, into motion a new layer of the curse. You see, because Pelops promised Myrtilus a reward for his assistance, but after winning the race, Pelops went back on his word and refused to honor the agreement. So, in retaliation, Myrtilus cursed Pelops and his descendants before being cast into the sea by Pelops and drowning there. While Pelops himself does not seem to have suffered directly from this curse in his own lifetime. I guess being chopped up and eaten and brought back to life was enough. Um, his this curse, though, the that was brought upon him by both the murder of Oenomaus and the betrayal of Myrtilus, would have lasting repercussions. Through his marriage with Hippodamia and the violent actions that he undertakes to secure it, Pelops uh, compounds the curse in his family. And he has many children, but the two most notable sons are Atreus and Thyestes. This is now the third generation of this family. Okay, Atreus, of course, will give his name to this whole house, the house of Atreus. And this generation saw the rivalry between Atreus and Thyestes, which culminated in one of the most infamous acts of vengeance in Greek myth, Atreus murdering Thyestes' sons and serving them to him to their father as a meal. This act ensured that the family's blood-stained history would persist into Agamemnon's time. So the two brothers, Atreus and Thyestes, engaged in a bitter dispute over the kingship of Mycenae, a city in the Peloponnese, whose people had been told that a son of Pelops should rule it, but they were not informed which son it should be. So to resolve the matter, Thyestes proposed a challenge. The brother who possessed a rare fleece made from the golden wool of a lamb would claim the throne. Well, Atreus had in his possession this prized fleece, and so he therefore agreed to the proposal, setting the stage for this rivalry that would lead to betrayal, deception, and tragedy. Atreus, as I say, had this fleece, and so he agreed to the challenge. However, unbeknownst to him, Thyestes seduced Atreus's wife, Irope, and she in turn gave Thyestes, her lover, the coveted fleece. Now, with this fleece in hand, Thyestes declared, I have the fleece, and thus I should be king. Yet Atreus, undeterred, pointed to a powerful omen, an unmistakable sign sent by the gods that validated his claim to the throne. The sun, in an extraordinary turn of events, set in the east, an omen so profound that all agreed Atreus should be king. Thyestes was consequently banished from Mycenae. But after the exile of Thyestes, Atreus, sitting around, began to be puzzled as to just how his brother had acquired that fleece. And he began to piece the mystery together, only to realize that it was his wife, Irope, who had betrayed him by having an affair with Thyestes. And so, seeking to avenge this dishonor and betrayal, Atreus invited Thyestes back to Mycenae under the pretense of reconciliation, but with a sinister twist. He demanded that Thyestes bring his children along. You can see where this is going. Atreus, consumed by anger and a desire for vengeance, devised his horrific plan. He invited Thyestes back and asked to bring his children, and invited him to a banquet um, to make peace with his brother, supposedly. Atreus, though, has the boys kind of trotted off. They are murdered out of sight of their father, cooked and served to Thyestes, who, not being a god, doesn't know what he is eating, and so he eats his own children. After the meal, Atreus reveals the horrifying truth to Thyestes, and the shock and despair of Thyestes knew no bounds as he realized the full extent of his brother's betrayal and his own uh, hideous action that he has committed. Now, this cast Thyestes out. Atreus cast him out of the kingdom again, but of course not before Thyestes cursed Atreus himself, ensuring that this curse on the family would continue in its devastating course. Um, and it's this whole event now then brings the cycle of violence. It shows this kind of paradigm of interfamilial violence, bloodshed, cannibalism, that each generation kind of is compelled to enact upon other members of the family. And so it is that the sons of Atreus are Agamemnon and Menelaus, and they are now laboring under this curse. And even though, and so when Agamemnon, going back now and connecting this with the Trojan War myth, when Agamemnon sacrificed Iphigenia, he was not merely fulfilling Artemis's, the goddess's demands. He was perpetuating his family's tragic cycle. And during his absence in the war, his wife, Clytemnestra, took Aegisthus, who happens to be none other than a later son of Thyestes, as her lover. Okay, and Aegisthus's whole raison d'etre, his whole purpose for living, is basically to be an avenger for what the father of Agamemnon had done to his father and his brothers. Okay. And so the play begins with Agamemnon's victory over Troy being announced. Okay. A watchman is on the roof and he is waiting to see a beacon fire that will kind of like Lord of the Rings, be like a series of beacons that get lit from Troy so that Clytemnestra can find out in the very night that it happens that Troy has fallen. Okay. And then Agamemnon will come back, and upon his victorious return, Clytemnestra, the wife, and Aegisthus, the lover, who is really the cousin of Agamemnon, will murder Agamemnon, setting the stage, obviously, for the next generation's retribution, because Agamemnon has a son, Orestes, and with the aid of his sister Electra, he will then be forced to avenge his own father's death, you see, by killing Aegisthus, which is, okay, no big deal, but also Clytemnestra, his own mother. Okay. And this interlocking cycle, this inescapable perpetuation of the cycle of bloodshed, is at the heart of the whole trilogy of the Oresteia. Now, all three major Greek tragedians, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, all engaged with different aspects of this myth in their plays. Sophocles and Euripides each wrote a version of the play Electra, that is the sister of Orestes, another daughter of Agamemnon. And those plays will focus on Orestes' revenge. Euripides also explored the fates of Agamemnon's children. He wrote a play, Iphigenia at Aulis. He also wrote a different version of that story, Iphigenia in Taurus, where Iphigenia does not actually die, and he wrote another play, Orestes. So he's very much exploring all of these too. However, the most comprehensive treatment of this story appears, no doubt, in Aeschylus's Oresteia, composed of the three plays Agamemnon, the Libation Bearers, and the Eumenides. And so, over the next several lectures, we will closely examine this trilogy, exploring its interdependent and interconnected themes, and how Aeschylus transforms this dark and crazy story of family murder into a profound meditation on larger and more philosophical themes, a meditation on justice, on the nature of vengeance, and upon the evolution of society. Thank you.